My name is Davis Tolman, and I believe that we can sometimes better understand complex issues by visualizing the data in order to gain insight into underlying trends. This presentation is titled A Visual Guide to Gerrymandering: How Politicians Choose Their Voters by Drawing Their Districts Based on Race. And I'm going to use the Houston area as an example of the U.S. House districts. Texas is a big state, but let's start by looking at where most Texans actually live. Each of these colors represents 20% of the population, ranging from low-density rural areas to high-density urban areas. Geographically, Texas is almost entirely rural, shown here in green, but rural areas represent only about 20% of the state's population. So increasingly, most folks live and work in and around our growing, connected, and evolving cities. Now we know that Texas has a diverse population, so let's look next at diversity across the state. This map shows the relative percentages of minority and white populations across the state. Minority populations are shown in purple, and primarily white populations are shown in green. As we can see, minority populations tend to be concentrated in the cities and along the southern border. Despite what we may think, we're still pretty segregated. If you live in a bright green or purple area, you probably live around a lot of folks who look just like you. Now let's take a moment and look at the detailed racial makeup of Texas. This subtle map uses color to show where minority groups tend to live. African Americans in East Texas in blue, Hispanics in red along the border, and if you look closely, you can see clusters of Asian populations around the cities shown in green. The very light areas are high percentages of white majority. Now I'm going to look at the minority-rich Greater Houston area and try and understand how this area is represented in the U.S. House of Representatives. This is the map frame we'll be looking at, primarily Harris and Fort Bend counties. Let's start by looking at the population density map again. Again, each color represents 20% of the state's population. There are over 4 million people in the Houston area. Each House district represents around 700,000 people, so we should be able to represent the Greater Houston area with about 6 districts. Now it might be logical to believe that politicians might use the population centers as a starting point for drawing districts. Well, if we look at the 6 U.S. congressional districts representing Houston, it doesn't seem that population centers were much of a factor when drawing these districts. Many district lines cut right through population centers. Some districts are very oddly shaped. If we color the districts, we can see how they spiral around each other, seemingly outward from the center of Houston. Keeping these districts in mind, let's look at how Houston's white and minority population is distributed. This precinct map shows where Houston's minority populations tend to live. Again, minority neighborhoods are shown in purple. The white neighborhoods are shown in green, and the lighter areas indicate mixed white and minority neighborhoods. I've outlined here the high concentration of minority voters. I've also noted here the existence of what we might think of as a white corridor to the west of town. So, Houston has an interesting mix of minority and white populations, each somewhat segregated into individual neighborhoods. So the question is, was race a factor when the state built the U.S. House districts in the Houston area? In order to test if gerrymandering is taking place, let's first look for evidence of packing of minority voters. Let's look at 3 House districts, 9, 29, and 18, which I've outlined here in blue. These districts account for about 2.1 million people. They seem to be limited to the high minority areas. Let's highlight these districts. These districts appear to be drawn purposefully to include only the concentration of minority voters. There are very few white or mixed precincts included in these packed districts. To me, this seems to suggest that race certainly was a factor in creating these districts. It should be no surprise that each of these districts went strongly for Democrats in the 2016 presidential election. So there seems to be evidence of packing. What about cracking, the other side of the gerrymandering coin? Cracking is the division of the remaining minority precincts in a way that their numbers are slightly outnumbered by voters in the white precincts. The remaining population was divided into 3 new districts, 22, 7, and 2. Each of these districts contains just enough white voters to offset the minority influence. As a result, the Houston area, although Democrat-leaning, has equal numbers of Republican and Democratic districts. Let's look at packing and cracking in a different way. In this slide, I've used bar charts to show the party preference and minority distribution for both Texas and the greater Houston area. Please note that party preference is based on the best available data that requires no normalization. In this case, the results of the 2016 presidential race is used as a proxy for party preference. So the greater Houston area is more Democrat and less white than the state as a whole. Now we can compare these same results for the 6 Houston area congressional districts, 3 Democrat and 3 Republican. Note the minimal number of white voters in the 3 Democratic districts, much less than the expected 30% for the Houston area average. These 3 districts show a very different distribution from state and local levels of diversity. Democrats carried these districts by wide margins. Alternatively, Republican districts have significantly more white voters than the citywide average. This mix helps to ensure a slim Republican victory. So in effect, Republican votes are used very effectively. There are very few wasted votes. And the Democrat votes are used very ineffectively. There are a large number of wasted votes. However, the situation could be a two-edged sword for Republicans. A small change in opinion of the voters could flip these close races. And I'm sure that a number of Democrats and moderate Republicans are trying to figure out how to make this happen. Now I want to end by talking about a disturbing observation. You may feel somewhat uncomfortable, as I do, in equating minority voters with Democrats and white voters with Republicans. But as uncomfortable as it is, here is the data. On this graph, I've plotted all Texas precincts as a dot, each dot sized by the number of voters in the precinct. Again, using the 2016 presidential election as a proxy for party affiliation, we know the Republican and Democrat voting percentages for each precinct. This election result is shown along the bottom axis. To the left are the more Democrat-leaning precincts, and to the right are the more Republican-leaning precincts. We also know from the census data the racial makeup of each precinct. This is on the vertical axis. To the top are the mostly white precincts, shown in green on our previous maps, and along the bottom are the precincts with the higher minority populations, shown in purple on the previous maps. And finally, the color shows the population density of the precinct. Green are rural areas, yellows and oranges are suburban areas, and reds are urban areas. This correlation is obvious. Most of the rural white voters preferred the Republican, green in the upper right, and the urban minority voters prefer the Democrat, red in the lower left. Now it bothers me that we are this divided. We might take some solace in the fact that some majority white precincts, primarily in the cities and suburbs, managed to buck this trend and vote Democrat. Alternatively, almost no minority precincts voted Republican. Gerrymandering should be a concern for all citizens. It contributes to racial divisiveness and to the radicalization of our politicians and their constituents. Most of all, it is un-American. If all men and women are truly created equal, then their vote should count equally also. I hope this presentation has helped you understand gerrymandering and how, like it or not, race is a factor in drawing political districts.